So let's then look at some quantitative descriptions of failure. Some quantitative descriptions of failure which you will find in the textbook there. The first one is the ROCOF, the rate of occurrence of failures. You will find in the textbook it was called the failure rate. So if you see failure rate there, we are talking of the rate of occurrence of failures. You will see also in number 6 here at the bottom, you will see that we call it the hazard function, which is called in the textbook. We also call it the force of mortality. Now, this will become clear to you as we go along. The problem is in conventional failure analyses, people tended to use the same term for more than one thing. Remember I said that we have the two situations. We have renewal, which we're looking at now, and we have repairable systems. Now, repairable systems is a much newer analysis method than renewal. And we said that the renewal is typical of components. Repairable systems is typical of systems that are repaired to be bad as old condition. Renewal typical of components that are repaired to be as good as new situation. Now, when Harry Asher, when he started saying, well, but wait, all things cannot be analyzed with renewal methods, we need another method. Then all of a sudden, the terminology that was in place became a problem. Because the ROCOF is really the failure rate. So what the term in the textbook there that says failure rate is the correct use of that term. The problem was that many people, and some of them very well known and very good practitioners of renewal, use the same term for the hazard function. So they call that the failure rate. And the hazard function and the ROCOF is two totally different things. They analyze totally different, they measure different things. In actual fact, the hazard function could be called the instantaneous failure rate. That's correct. Instantaneous failure rate. But the problem is that they left the instantaneous out and they just called it the failure rate because it was so convenient. But it is not a failure rate. That function is not a failure rate. A failure rate is simply so many failures per time. That's a failure rate. Whereas that function is a different function. It's a function that says if I have a population of, let's say I have 1,000 of the same component, or I don't have 1,000, but I have 1,000 times that the same component failed. So I have 1,000 failure times for the component. No, the better way to explain it is if I have 1,000 components and I monitor them over time, and some of them start failing, and I get at a certain point in time, then the thing is to say, well, what is the failure rate at this point in time of this population, given that so many of them has already failed, or given that so many of them still survives? So that is the instantaneous failure rate. In other words, it is a failure rate, but it is based on the actual situation of that population at that point in time. Whereas a normal failure rate is not so. It's just simply the number of failures per time. It does not have that other thing involved. So the good way would be for yourself to say, well, I can equate ROCOF to failure rate and get rid of failure rate in number 6 completely. Harry says, get rid of failure rate completely. Forget about the term failure rate. Forget about that, because that's a bad and confusing term. And he then suggested those two terms, the rate of occurrence of failure and the force of mortality. He said, let's call it that. Then we know which one is which. And then we don't get confused. But unfortunately, when you start reading theory in other textbooks and so on, you will invariably have the problematic that you see people using the term failure. And then you have to decide for yourself, well, what are they talking about? Are they talking about the Rokoff, or are they talking about the force of mortality? Which one are they talking about? And typically they would be talking of the force of mortality, and that is the case for which you may never use the term failure rate. So if you use the term failure rate for the force of mortality, I'm going to put not a red cross like this, I'm going to put a red cross like this. Because then you misunderstand something crucial. So make sure that you understand that difference. Okay, so we'll try to explain something. So the Rokoff. The Rokoff, or the rate of occurrence of failures, that's what it stands for, is an indication of how fast failures are following one another. It is calculated by dividing the number of failures by some quantitative measure of the cumulative use of the system or the component to accumulate the failures. The Rokoff is a very useful measure in determining whether the reliability of a system or a subsystem is busy improving, or it is constant, or it is decreasing. I must just say something about my slides. I have a new version of the software, and this happens sometimes. But on the slides, as you have it on the PDFs, you will have it rendering. Okay, so the Rokoff is then why do I get the Rokoff is then the number of failures in the period divided by the length of the period. And typical units is failures per hour, or failures per ton, or failures per unit produced, or whatever. It depends on what unit you use for your period. The typical Rokoff looks like that. That's a specific set that's talked about here. Let me just do something about that. That's what it wanted to say. Typical Rokoff for the system. Typical Rokoff for the system. Looks like that. So what it says, what does it say? It says that when we have a system, we would expect as the system ages that the rate of occurrence of failures picks up. Does that make sense? So the system, when it's new, the rate of occurrence of failures fairly low, but as it ages, you find more and more components of that system failing for the first time. So let's say you have this new system. For the first year or two, you find very little things that go wrong, virtually nothing. typically also covered by guarantees during that first period. And then you find that, let's say, one thing goes wrong. I have my motor car, and the first thing that goes wrong is that I have to replace a set of tires. I'm now just excluding the services and so on. So I have a set of tires that goes, and now let's say that was after 80,000 kilometers. What I now expect is I expect that after another 80,000 kilometers, another set of tires will go, and so on. It might differ because of brands of tires, driving conditions, and so on. But in principle, I would think that would happen every 80,000 kilometers. And then after 2 years, 3 years, battery goes. So I would expect that every 3 years I have to replace a battery. And then, so now I have tires that's going, I have batteries that's going, but all the other components of the car is still okay. And then I have a third component going. You understand the principle, and this picks up. So as the thing ages, you will expect the Rokoff to pick up. And that says nothing. That says nothing about whether you must now replace the system or whatever. That's an economic decision. What this says is it just says that it is practical to expect that these components that were all new when the thing was new will in time start needing replacement. After replacement, I will typically then sit with an as bad as old situation, in other words, the repairable system situation for the whole system. So what we're talking about here is we are talking about a system. So we will also be using this specific measurement of the Rokoff. We will be using more for systems than for components. The component, it doesn't make that much sense. The second one is the mean time to failure. We say the mean time to failure is the reciprocal of the Rokoff. In other words, it is 1 over the Rokoff. So it is just the opposite, 1 over the Rokoff. Thus, where the Rokoff represents the numbers of failure per time or other measuring unit, the mean time to failure gives an indication of the average life between successive failures in operating hours, or whatever other measuring unit. It does serve the same purpose as the Rokoff and is sometimes preferred by maintenance people. As is the case with the decreasing Rokoff, an increasing mean time to failure will be an indication that the system's reliability is improving, while a decreasing mean time to failure, like an increasing Rokoff, will indicate reliability. In actual fact, what we expect is, again, you expect, where you expected the Rokoff like this, you expect an mean time to failure that goes down. In other words, the longer you have the system, the shorter the mean time between failures, or time to failure, mean time to failure. I must not say between failures because that's a confusing term. Mean time to failure becomes. And while I'm now confusing you, let me explain the confusion. Because otherwise you remain confused. What we're saying is, if you have something, a unit, let's call it a unit, and the unit fails, F stands to fail, and we repair the unit, we have it repaired there, and it runs again up to the point where it again fails, whether that's our component or it's just a unit. Then what we call this is we call this the time to repair. Or if we consider many such time to repairs and we average it, we call it the mean time to repair. This here we call the time to failure, because it's the time from repair to failure, time to fail. Average of that mean time to failure. If we take this total here, we call that the time between failures. And the average of that is the mean time between failures. So that's important to understand as well. So that's why I immediately corrected myself when I started talking about mean time between failures, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the mean time to failure. In other words, we're measuring that. The mean time to failure is 1 over the row. The third quantity is the failure density. The failure density. I thought my timing is off. My computer says 10 o'clock, 10:07. But I was in Ireland last week, so it's still on that number. Right, failure density is the third one. The failure density gives a picture of the probability of failure of a component over its own life. Now let me just say those first two quantities that we consider is repairable systems type of quantities. That's we're considering the life of a whole system. We said that we're talking about systems. Because if we look at components, and let's just use my tire example as a basis for explaining it. When I think of my tires, and I think that every 80,000 kilometers nominally, I will be replacing a set of tires, my row cost for the set of tires remains constant. It's 1 over 80,000 or whatever it is. My mean time to failure is 80,000. It's also a constant. So the moment that you work with components, the things that we analyze in terms of renewal, you will find that you have a constant row cost, a constant mean time to failure. Nominally, it might differ a little. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I'm
no, sure.
working my hand. Rock-off is rate of occurrence of failures.
Yes.
So that's from F to F.
Yeah.
But the reciprocal is 1 over that 1 over. No, time MTTF.
Rock-off is this.
Where is that? The repair time go? If MTTF is the reciprocal of rock-off,
Yeah.
then there's a time difference between the two.
Yeah. The repair time is not included in your rock-off because you just want to look at what rate does the thing fail, the rate of occurrence of failures, running rate of it. In other words, when it's down, that time is not considered in that equation.
But it's the reciprocal of that one, they're not MTVF.
No, the reciprocal of time to failure, of mean time to failure, is the row-off. What we're saying in both cases, whether you talk of the mean time to failure or whether you talk of the row-off, you don't consider repair time. It's just running time. But okay, we'll come back to that. Corner me again when we get there and you're still confused. So now the other four quantities that we're going to look at now is more in the renewal field. We're more talking of components. So we say that the failure density gives the picture of probability of the failure of a component over its own life. You see, we now specifically say a component. So we're looking at the probability of failure of a component over its own life. It thus gives at any particular point in the life of the component the probability of failure at exactly that point. Okay. And a typical failure density would look something like that. This T-scale could be, instead of going 0, 1, 2, it could be 0, 100, 200, or 0, 1,000, 2,000, whatever, depending on on the scale of failure of that specific component. The second of that class of quantities is the cumulative failure distribution. We say that by cumulative summation of the probabilities of failure as depicted in the failure density above, the cumulative failure distribution results. And that is then the integral between minus infinity and infinity of ft being the density function, ft dt. So you sum the area under the density function to get a cumulative failure distribution. It thus gives the probability that the component will have failed before or at any point in time. And one could then look at it in this way. So what we have here is we have that density function. And what we're saying is if we look at the area up to a certain point in time, then that will give the height here, capital FT, which is then the failure distribution function, or the cumulative failure distribution. Yes.
I don't consider myself as that expert, but shouldn't the integral between negative infinity and t?
Between negative infinity and t. Yes.
Otherwise, it's always one.
Yes, I think what we're talking about is we're talking about in the extreme here, you will have minus infinity, between minus infinity and infinity. You're absolutely correct. If you catch what he's saying, he's saying that this should be between minus infinity and t. And that's correct. Sorry guys, but you're the first guy after 3 years of doing this that is suggested.
One day.
Guys, you don't have to battle. It's true what the man is saying. This thing, if you integrate that to infinity, you will get a value of 1. So that value of ft will be equal to 1. And that's not what the idea was. So you're absolutely. Where am I now? There. So that should be t. That should be small t. And so that's what we have there. In other words, ft is the integral, which is that area, is the integral from, well, in actual fact, you could say from 0 to that point t. But just to be mathematically correct, we start at minus infinity. In practical terms, of course, we will never have failures lower than 0, so you can just as well start by doing that. We say this cumulative failure distribution always starts at the probability of 0, which we saw on that graph, which is equivalent to stating that a new component will not be in the failed state. In other words, it will not have failed. But remember, we're talking now of that resultant figure that we have there. In other words, this is the cumulative failure distribution. So what we're saying is, we're saying when it's brand new, it will not have failed. That's why it's 0 there. The second thing that it says, let me just see that I do the right thing here now. The second thing that we say, it will always eventually have a value of 1 or 100%. Why? That indicates that the component will eventually fail with 100% certainty. So, thus, eventually it will end up at 1 or 100%, which is then that integral from minus infinity to infinity, the value there, will give me that line. The fifth function is the survival function. We say the cumulative distribution gives the probability of failure before or at a certain age. The difference between that and the level of 100% gives the probability that the component will survive up to that point. That it will survive up to that point, and that's given by RT equals 1 minus FT. This is a very useful measure, and we show it this way. So there we have just the opposite of FT, 1 minus FT gives you RT, and you get a graph that goes like that. That starts at 1, in other words saying that all components of that class will survive at time 0, and always ends up at a level of 0 in infinity, saying that all components of a specific class will eventually fail. It might be a very long period, that period, but it will eventually fail. Eventually it will fail. That's one of the problematics, let me just say while I'm thinking about it, that's one of the problematics of systems. That in systems you find some components that will fail over the practical life of the system. But when you get to the end of the system, there will still be many components that have never failed. It's like that. But that will not say that they won't ever fail. They might just not be used up to their logical life because the system is not, it's not practical to use the system anymore. The system is old. The system it doesn't make economical sense to keep the system on running. But the fact is that any such component will eventually fail. I always use the example of my father's first television set. Which we still have. It's a Philips television set. And that television set has been in for repairs a few times, but it's still working. So most of its components has never been replaced. It's still working, and we're now talking about very nearly 40 years old. But there are components that failed, that had to be replaced. What we are saying here is we're saying that we now subtract ft from 1, which says that that proportion there, up there, is the proportion of components that survives up to that age. Here we show it saying, well, this is the survival function. So this is the proportion of components that survive, but the opposite of that is that is the proportion of components that fails before or at that age. And of course that is shown there, that the area under the curve to the right of that point then gives you the proportion that survives. And when we start doing sums, you will see that we work with RT and with FT, or we don't work with FT typically. We replace that FT then with 1 minus RT. We then say that area is 1 minus RT, that area there is RT, and then we start doing all types of manipulations. So that is then the survival function. The last one is the hazard function, or the force of mortality, and the preferred name is the force of mortality. In the book we call it the hazard function. The most useful of the last 4 quantitative measures, which is also called the 4 reliability functions, is the hazard function or the force of mortality. I had it in my mind when I worked with the force of mortality that the acronym is small letters FOM. But then of late I saw that Harry Asher uses capital FOM, so you can just as well use capital FOM as It's also called the conditional probability of failure or the momentary probability of failure, or we said that you could also call it the instantaneous failure rate, although I want to shy away from that terminology. So it's a conditional probability of failure or the momentary probability of failure. It gives the probability that the component will fail at a certain life, given that it has survived up to that age. So that's what it says. So we say it is the probability that the failure time T star will be smaller than T plus dt, given that the failure time is larger than T. In other words, it has survived up to T. This is what this says. It has survived up to T. It's still living at T, but it fails before T or T plus dt. Then it's that probability dt that you are looking at. That is the definition of ZT, and the force of mortality. Which then leads to eventually, if you can then derive from that you can calculate ZT by FT, which is your density function, divided by RT, which is your survival function. Yes.
Could you please just describe that formula using maybe numbers?
This one.
Yes.
That one is not a number.
No, I'm saying in terms of time. Use like real numbers.
Okay. Let's say we're now at time 100.
Yes.
Let's say we're working on a scale of 1,000. Let's say we're now at time 100. We're saying, well, what is the probability, given that it has lived up to 100, that it will fail before 110? If the dt is then 100, it's then 10. So that is what force of mortality measures. Is I'm now at this age, I know that it has lived up to this age. What is the probability that it will fail in the next moment? That's why it's called an instantaneous failure rate. So if the hazard function is decreasing with age or constant, we say there will be no incentive. We must now understand something. Before I say this, I want to say something about what we're saying here. We're saying it is the probability of the thing failing given that it has lived up to now. That probability. That instantaneous probability. That is sort of a risk figure. In other words, it says what is the risk that this thing will fail now, given that it has survived up to now. So what is that risk? Now, what we're now saying on the next screen is we're saying if that risk is decreasing with age, because you get components for which that is true, when that risk decreases over time, then it would not make sense to replace that thing in a use-based sense. In other words, if the risk at 100, let's use the example that we've been working. If the risk at 200 is lower than the risk at 100, why will I replace that component with a new one at 100? Because a new one's risk will even be higher, because it's busy decreasing the risk.
So surely, like a general product would go from very high risk for obviously bold reasons, like if there's iron filings, say in the case or something like that, then go to very low, and then eventually it would go to very high risk again, because I mean it's of cycles of run, so you would have a limit that it would decrease, and then eventually it would get high again, because everything has a shelf life. I mean, you can't, nothing will run infinite.
Think about my father's Philips TV set. There's still many of those things that are still running. I don't know what the risk is, but the risk is not such that one will even attempt to replace that.
But whether that life be 1,000 years, like say capacitor having just air corrosion or something like that on those components, it might have a life of 1,000 years. So, but eventually when it starts getting to 990 years, your risk will go up. So you will sort of.
We will look into that. Look into that. But I think for the moment the easy way out, my easy way out, is to say, well, let's talk about the practical life of that component. In other words, we often find it's true what you're saying. We often find that things turn around, that the risk pattern becomes something different. We are just talking about the major risk pattern at this point in time. We'll come back to that.
So, Prof, just to make you wrap my mind around this one. So, if you're a human and you're the machine, and you're 100 years old, the chance of being 101 is surely a lot more than when you're an individual of 30 years old, getting to 101. Increasing. Is that correct?
Yeah, but you're now talking about something different. You talk about absolute probabilities and incremental probabilities.
But my point is the absolute probability of getting to 101 is surely less than the instantaneous probability of getting to 101 if you're 100.
You're right. You're right. Of course it must be. I mean, if you look at the population and the number that collapsed to 400, then that must be true. There's no doubt about that. Yes.
Prof, an example of something being less probable to fail is, for instance, a breach, where the concrete strengthens over time and becomes just stronger and stronger and stronger. So that in that case, it wouldn't make sense to replace a 100-year-old breach with a new one.
Yeah, depends on things like that. I think your example is still valid. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. This is true of many mechanical systems also, because mechanical systems tend to bed in as they start life. They are new, but they're not bedded in. They're not honed in optimally. And so mechanical systems tend to, when they work under perfect circumstances, I must also say that, when they work under perfect circumstances, then they tend to bed in. That's why you will find that in a car's engine, when the risk of it failing when it's brand new is higher than when it's got 100,000 kilometers on that engine. If it has, simply because the running circumstances of such an engine is fairly perfect. You have very good air filtration. You have very good care of your oils that you replace in time and so on. So the fact is that it hones in, and all the honing material, all that things are removed through replacing the oils and having good filtration and so on. So you have a near perfect situation. But it turns around. But it turns around later on. You know, the point that you make. It turns around. So when something happens typically, let's say the owner once forgot to put a new air filter in, or the air filter got a hole in, and all of a sudden the whole situation turns around. But okay. So the fact is that when something has a decreasing force of mortality, it does not make sense to replace it with a new one because the new one has a higher force of mortality. When something has a constant force of mortality, that's the second thing that we're talking about, then again it will not make sense because the new unit will have exactly the same force of mortality. So, and the typical example of that is electronic components. That's why I can talk about the Philips TV set so much, because electronic components tend to have a constant force of mortality. We call that a random shock failure pattern, meaning that it is random. Failure is random, and it's typically based on shock, some other type of shock. So when something happens to that component, to high voltage or something, or a lightning strike or something, it just goes poof, and it's gone. But it's random, it's based on shock. So if the lightning never occurred, the thing wouldn't have failed. Okay. In such a case, the only preventive strategy available will be that of condition-based preventive maintenance. That's just the point that we want to make. That the only strategy that you can follow is condition-based maintenance. Nothing else. In other words, you must monitor, try to find out when something will go wrong. In many cases, you can't even do that. Look at electronic components. You cannot monitor that thing practically. When do you know when will the lightning come? You know. Yeah, you have of course systems that try to prevent lightning from having an effect on it, but that's not the same thing. So you cannot really know when it's going to fail, so you cannot even practice condition-based maintenance on such components. But it is the only practical thing that's available. We say, but in the case of an increasing hazard function, which is a situation often encountered in components, use-based preventive maintenance will certainly be an option, as that will lower the risk of failure. So, and that is what we have. If we have an increasing force of mortality, then we can do that. We can replace the component with a new one, we can cut its life short, replace it with a new one, and immediately your risk falls from there to there. So that risk you cut out, you cut it off, and you go from here to here. And what we need to do to decide where this point is we now need to include money figures. We need to include economics. And then we can decide when is that point? When will that point occur? We say it's easy to see that the use-based maintenance will bring no benefit in cases where the hazard curve is decreasing.